Morning, my friends. I'm Pastor Ben Hayes from First Baptist Church, Dadeville, Alabama, and I'm bringing you our thought for the day on this wonderful Thursday. We had a great night last night in church. Hope that you were there wherever you live, that you enjoyed time fellowshipping. We had a great meal, great time of prayer, and great time of Bible study. God is so good. We're so blessed. And I'm thinking about this day because it's kind of a dreary day here in Dadeville. It's overcast, supposed to get some rain today. But you know, the sun is shining above the clouds. And the old saying is true. Not only is the sun shining above the clouds, the sun, S-O-N, is shining in our hearts. And I know it's kind of corny, but it's true. And no matter where we are, no matter what our circumstances are as believers, the sun is always shining in our hearts. And praying today that the light of God's love is shining on you, shining through you as a believer. And so as we talk about that, let's go to the book of James again, the end of chapter 4. We've been talking about this passage where James says, so often we say tomorrow I'm going to go to this city and I'm going to sell things, I'm going to make a profit. And he says, wait a minute, guys, understand, your life is like a vapor. It's here today, gone tomorrow. You can't count on your next breath, let alone tomorrow or next year. So what you ought to do is say, if the Lord wills and he allows me to live, then I'm going to do that. Decisions, the choices that we make, we need to go to the Father and seek his guidance on those kinds of decisions. Because he tells us, he says in verse 16, but now you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Well, what's he talking about there? That seems kind of out of sync with what he's dealing with. But here's the thing. Anytime we make a decision without consulting the Father, that's boastful arrogance. To think that we have the ability, the wisdom, the right in our lives to say, I'm going to go and do this. Understand, most of us, when it comes to big decisions, we go to the Father. Where we're going to go to college, what am I going to study, what am I going to do with my life, am I going to get married, who am I going to marry, those kinds of things. We come to the Father, especially if we're believers, mature believers, and we call out to him and say, Father, I need your guidance, I need your wisdom about this. And he guides us. The Bible promises us that he will. But what about the ordinary decisions of life? How many times have you bought a car in your life? Did you go to the Father and ask him if you should do that? We ought to. What about when you changed jobs? Did you ask the Father if you should do that? We ought to. But what about the ordinary daily decisions that we make in life? Now, I'm not talking about, what am I supposed to wear kind of thing, but I'm talking about, what am I supposed to do today? How am I supposed to minister today? How am I supposed to interact with these people today? Praying for those things. Sonia and I, before we left the house this morning, we prayed, and that's exactly what I asked him to show me. How can I be a better minister today? How can I touch the lives of these particular people today? Because when we don't do that, when we don't trust in him, we don't go to him in that humble surrender of the servant, it is boastful arrogance. And James says all such boasting is evil. Now, I want to pick up the next verse here because it seems out of context. It doesn't seem to flow with what we're talking about. Look at verse 17. He says, therefore to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. Now, here's how I know that it's not out of context. When the word therefore is used, it's there for a reason, and it means based on what I've just told you, this is what you ought to do. So he's connecting for us verse 17 with verses 13 through 16. And so what he's talking about here, when we know that we're supposed to go to the Father and ask for his guidance and ask for his wisdom in humble surrender, and we don't do it, that is sin. Now, it's a sin of omission. Now, what does that mean? That means that when we know that we're supposed to do something and we don't do it, it's sin. There's a sin of commission, those things that we do when we know we shouldn't do it. That's sin. Paul says that he struggles with both of those. He says those things I ought to do, I don't do. Those things I shouldn't do, I do. We're all guilty of that. We find ourselves in those situations. But here specifically, James is talking about going to the Father and saying, is this your will for my life? How many times do we pray that? Well, I think we ought to pray it every day, probably multiple times a day, especially when we're confronted with decisions that will affect the lives of other people, that will affect our families, that will affect us. Should I do this, Lord? Guide me, give me wisdom, show me what I'm supposed to do. Because when we know we're supposed to do that and we don't, James says it's sin. Think about that today. Would you make a commitment that today, every decision you're going to make, whether large or small, just go to the Father and ask Him to guide you? I know it can be difficult to do that, but just listen for the voice of the Father, and He will. Be blessed. I'll see you back here tomorrow.